Congressman, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with us. When you came here to Washington, you came with a laundry list of items that you wanted to tackle, not the least of which was immigration, balancing our budget. But from a lot of people's standpoints, we haven't seen a lot of movement or anything getting done in those issues. So I guess my question to you is, what is being done?
I'd like to know who those people are because they're wrong. The first thing, if you look at balancing the budget, my goal was to get us to spending at a level that makes sense for us as Americans. My first year here in Congress, we had a $1.5 trillion deficit. That was my first year. Today, we're going to have a $450 billion deficit. Now, am I proud that we have a $450 billion deficit? No. But am I proud that because of my efforts, we have gone from $1.5 trillion to $400 billion? Absolutely. And if I weren't here, that wouldn't be happening. Because what you have is the old establishment of the Republican Party who kept saying, well, you know, we need to cut, but we don't really want to cut too much. We don't want to do anything that's hard. The voters are not going to like the things that we're doing if we're too precipitous in the way that we're cutting. And that's just not true. The American people sent us here with a clear message. So on that issue, we have had some major victories. On immigration, we have tried to do reasonable immigration reform. We have passed out of the House of Representatives guest worker bills for high-tech workers. We have passed out of the House of Representatives good bills on border security. Now, the Senate has not taken them up, but we have done what was required of us. And the most important thing we did on immigration was we killed the disastrous Senate bill that would have granted amnesty to 12 million people and would have done nothing for our national security.
Talk to me real quick about the relationship between the Republican Party and the Republican Party that you see as perhaps the more conservative values.
Well, what I see is the difference between the people back home and the political class here in Washington, D.C. When you talk to the people here in Washington, D.C., they give you a laundry list of things that they've accomplished that for the most part do not resonate with the people back home. The people back home are concerned about everyday issues. They're concerned about jobs, about the economy. They want to make sure that they can put food on the table. You have parents that are concerned about the future of their children, and they don't hear sometimes from our leadership the message that we care about them. What they see from our leadership is a group of people that really care about the political class and the donor class, but they don't care about everyday individuals. When I go back home, I talk to real people. And I do, when you go to a town hall meeting that I do very little talking. In fact, I usually spend like 5 minutes in an introductory remarks, and then I take a lot of questions. That's pretty exhausting, an hour and a half to 2 hours of just answering questions. By the end of a town hall meeting, I'm pretty tired because I'm answering just about any kind of question, but it's important for me to hear from them instead of them always hearing a lecture from me. And I think too many politicians love to lecture their constituents, and I would rather listen to my constituents.
Speaking about that, I think there's a lot of frustration with Congress, which is from a standpoint of people feel like it's getting stuff done. They don't think that at all. Is it hard to bring a mentality like that, what you have back in Idaho, here to Washington?
It is very difficult. You know, I look at the time that I spent in the legislature, in the state legislature. That was probably some of the most proud moments of my life, where the work that we did in the state legislature. You see a system where it works, where you have to balance the budget at the end of the year. You do appropriations, but you know that those appropriations have to reach a certain limit. And you know that you can't be borrowing money to make your appropriations bills balanced by the end of the year. All those things are done in a very responsible way. You have all the legislatures in the United States that try to do that kind of work. Here in Congress, the problem that we have is that we can borrow money and we can print money. And if we don't really come to a balance and we come to an agreement on what the needs of the United States are going to be, the Republicans go around saying that they're going to borrow more money, and the Democrats go around saying that they're going to raise our taxes. And eventually both things happen a little bit. So no one's taking real responsibility. No one's doing the hard work that you have to do at the state legislative level. You know, you have to sit down and you have to look at what the priorities of the state are, what the things are that we need to do, what things we can do this year, what things we can do next year. We never have to do that here in Congress. It's one of the reasons that I sometimes vote no on a lot of things. I even voted no on the Republican budget this year because they had this fiction that we could somehow increase military spending without increasing anything else on the social programs. And the president has told us that if we increase military spending, we're going to have to increase social programs, and we're going to have to increase spending on all these other things. So all these victories that we've had over the last few years when it comes to spending, we're about to throw them out the window if we don't keep track of what we're spending.
Speaking of that, when you talk about balancing the federal budget or reducing the spending, how do you do that without damaging programs that directly benefit Idaho? For instance, what's happening and the work that's happening out at the Idaho National Laboratory.
You know, you have to look at every single program that we have, and nothing can be sacred. And I think that's the problem that politicians have and that the political class has, is that they're always looking at their backyard and they're saying, you scratch my back, I'm going to scratch your back. If you make sure you don't cut my program, I'm going to make sure I don't cut your program. Well, guess what the result of that kind of relationship is? It's an $18 trillion now going on $19 trillion debt. If we continue to do that and we continue to just take care of ourselves and take care of our backyard, you're gonna come to a point where we're gonna just break as a nation. We're gonna go bankrupt as a nation, and that's completely irresponsible because then we're gonna have money for nothing. If we continue the trajectory that we're going right now, what's going to happen is that pretty soon all we're going to have is enough money to pay for entitlement spending and for the debt. We're not going to have enough money for the military. We're not going to have enough money for the, for Homeland Security, for immigration enforcement, and guess what? We're not going to have any money for the INL if we continue to spend at the amount of at the rate that we're doing. So if we're not responsible, if we don't start looking at every single agency and we start looking at every single department and the areas where we can cut, where we can be more fiscally responsible, pretty soon we're not going to have enough money for any of those things that we think are valuable.
Talk about the different in climate and trying to get things done when we have a presidential election right around the corner next year. While we were here in Washington, Donald Trump was in town speaking about a deal in Iran. But when you have these candidates that are going out and hitting the campaign trail, does it make it more difficult to get work done here in Washington? I
don't think so. What you're seeing right now in this presidential campaign is that the American people are completely dissatisfied with the political class. They're completely dissatisfied with the leadership here in Washington, D.C. And that's why people like Donald Trump, like Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina, they're really resonating with people. They have no experience, but the most important thing they have is they don't have ties to the political class here in Washington, D.C. I think the Republican Party is fed up with the lack of action. We told them that in 2010 that if they gave us the House, we were going to change the way Washington worked. We changed that a little bit. Then we lost the 2012 election, and we promised them that if they gave us the Senate in 2014, we were going to stop Obama and we were going to stop everything that the Democrats were doing. Well, right now it makes absolutely no difference that we have Senator Mitch McConnell as the majority leader instead of Harry Reid, because the person who's making all the decisions is President Obama. Obama is saying, I'm going to veto a certain bill, and our leadership is so feckless that they get scared, and they decide that they're not going to work on legislation that the president might veto. Well, so what? They might veto the legislation this year. We can pass it again next year. He might veto it again, but at least we'll have a message to the American people why it's important to have a Republican president in the White House. But if we're not even willing to fight for the things that we told the American people that we're going to fight for, the American people are going to say, then why should I fight for you? Why, there's a difference. And I heard actually this from a union organizer. There's a big difference between getting a vote and getting support. A vote is when one individual goes to the polls and votes for you. Support is when you have a large group of people going out there and getting their friends and their family and their unions, whatever it is, going out and organizing for you. The Democrats are very good at organizing. They're very good at getting people out there excited about their message. We tend to think that we don't have to listen to our constituencies and we don't have to listen to the people back home because we somehow know better than they do about what needs to happen here in Washington, D.C. And that's why we don't get the huge support that we sometimes should. Our ideas win. Look at the last election. Romney, on every single issue, won the polls. If you look at the polling data, on issues of education, spending, military, all those issues, Romney did better than Obama. The only area where he failed was, do you care about people like me? When you ask the question, which candidate cares about people like you, Obama trounced Romney. Because Romney was speaking to the political class, and Obama was speaking to the people. We have a better message, but we don't use it as effectively as the other side.
Speaking of that, what's got to change then here in Washington? When we talk about the leadership just a moment ago, you voted against Speaker Boehner for the speakership. I mean, what's got to change, and how do you get to that point?
Well, I voted against him 2 years ago, and I voted for him this time because he made me a promise that he was going to change, that he was going to work with McConnell, and it was going to be different. Well, that promise has not been kept. And I've been very disappointed. And it was not popular back home when I voted for the speaker, but I was giving him a chance because we had a new House, a new Senate. We had the largest majorities we had ever had in a generation or more. And I thought that things would change now that we have a Senate majority. I think things are worse. And what needs to change is either they change as a leadership team, or we need to change the leadership team. And that's what, and that's what this month is really about. This next month of September, if we can't get the leadership to actually listen to the American people, to listen to our constituents, to listen to us, they serve at our pleasure. We're not their employees, they're our employees. They need to start listening to the things that we're saying. And if they don't do that, then we need to have a change in leadership.
Are you planning on that, voting for a change of leadership, say 2 years from now?
Oh, I'm not voting for Boehner again. That's just not going to happen. But there could be a change in leadership even sooner than that if he doesn't start listening to the message that the American people are sending us.
Talk to me about some of your pet projects that you've got going on right now, one of which being criminal justice.
Yes.
Where are we at there, and what's getting done?
That's one of the most exciting things that I think we're working on. A lot of people say that I'm very partisan, that I only work on Republican issues. I'm actually not a very partisan person. I'm a very conservative person. But if I can work with Democrats on an issue, I will work with them. And that's one of the most exciting things that I've been doing, is working with Republicans and Democrats on criminal justice reform. We had a great meeting at the White House where we met with the president, the vice president, members of the cabinet, and many members of Congress that are working on bipartisan legislation. I hope that we can get something done in the next year or two. What we're finding here is that it's not really a political or partisan issue. It's more of a generational issue. Some of the older conservatives and older Republicans and Democrats are opposed to any kind of prison reform and criminal justice reform. Some of the younger members of Congress are actually more in tune with what's happening out there and are okay with doing some criminal justice reform. We have a big bill.
What do you find that they're pushing back on, some of the older generation that you call? What are they saying, we're not on board with this?
Well, I think they rightly remember what happened in the 60s and the 70s and the lawlessness that was happening during some of those periods. And they're concerned that if we're not tough on crime, that we're going to go back to that lawlessness. And I actually share their concern. But we have to be smart on crime as well. We need to continue to be tough. So we can't be like the 60s and the 70s that you don't punish crimes. But what you can say is that you have to be careful in how long the sentences are. For example, is it really smart to put a young kid who is guilty of a minor drug offense in prison for several years when treatment would actually work for that person much better than putting them in prison? Many of these young people go into prison and they come back as harsher criminals. They're actually hardcore criminals by the time they come out. And when they went in, they were just young people that were inexperienced. Is it a good idea to close off avenues and opportunities for young people that have committed minor nonviolent drug offenses? Do we really need to stigmatize them for the rest of their lives? That affects their future employment opportunities, all those things. Those are things that as a society we need to think about, and we need to see if there's a better way. And I think there is a smarter way to deal with them without legalizing drugs, without legalizing their behavior, but by treating them in a better way that I think is better for society.
You're talking about an older generation and a younger generation, and I think the mindset has changed somewhat in regards to, say, public lands.
Yes.
How that public land is being utilized and viewed and used, for lack of a better term. What's participating? What's pushing this into a new way of thinking, and is this good for our government?
Well, I'm not sure if there's a generational shift, and maybe you'll have to give me more information on that. But I know in Idaho, there's a huge difference between the East and the West. People who live in the West understand that it's not smart for us to have 65% of our state owned by the federal government. It's not smart for us to have 65% of our state encumbered with all these federal regulations, with all these prohibitions of what we can do on those lands. And what you see is a lot of dissatisfaction and frustration. You look at the fires that happened in Idaho this year, you see a lot of frustration with the federal government, with the level of protections that we have, with the level of management, and even what happens after the fires, the level of recovery that we get. Is the state lands, even if the federal lands and the state lands burn at the same rate and burn just as frequently, what happens is the management after the fire is the recovery is much more quick when it comes to the state lands than it is with the federal lands. And I think that's something that we have to consider, because we have different rules and regulations that we have to abide by. If you talk to the people in the areas that were burnt, they saw a lot of difference in how the state lands burnt versus the federal lands burnt. The intensity of the fire was much stronger on the federal lands, and the quickness and the speed of the fire was much more on the federal lands. There's a lot of things that we have to be thinking about. And what's really sad is that this summer we had a really wet spring that caused a lot of growth to happen on our federal lands, and they were all being prevented in those areas from actually grazing on those lands. And that caused the fires that we have. That was huge concern. And I think if we would have had the ability to actually manage it like we should have, we wouldn't have the many fires that we had. You can't prevent forest fires. They're a catastrophic event, and I'm not saying at all that if we manage it at the state level that we're never going to have a forest fire. But I think you're going to have better management of those lands.
So specifically, when you say we, do you mean the state should
The
take over
state.
management from the feds?
Absolutely.
And do you think the state can handle that financial burden?
Absolutely, because if you can handle, if you can own, you can manage the land under state management practices. You can use it for the uses that the state allows. You can use the natural resources on that land. If you can do all those things under state management practices, you're going to have enough money to manage it and enough money to work with the fires and all those things. And we're talking about management. So, while it's being managed, a lot of the money will come from the federal government. But that's why I have a piece of legislation that would transfer management of our lands to the state, so we can show it's a pilot project. We would take over 200,000 acres of our state, we would manage it under state management practices, and we would show that we can do a better job than the federal government can.
We've been hearing about this 200,000 acre pilot plant for some time now, a number of years. We haven't seen that done yet. Are we any closer to having that become a reality?
Well, we passed it in the House, and again, the problem is the Senate. The Senate has not, until this year, it was in Democratic hands. We couldn't get Harry Reid to even give it a vote on the floor. And we're going to continue to fight. I mean, you come here and you keep fighting and you keep fighting and you keep trying to get good policy in place. The Democrats disagree with me on this, and hopefully we can get the Senate to take it up. But we've actually passed that out of the House.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Congressman.
All right, thank you.
Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.